Good morning, ladies and gentlemen in the room online. Welcome to TIPS. My name is Nokwanda Maseko, and I will be chairing this learning event today. So as you would have seen from the invitation, the aim of this learning event is to present some findings from various studies that has been conducted through TIPS, through Just SA, as well as through the Just Transition Labour Center. So we will have 4 presenters and 3 presentations today. The first one that is almost here would be Muhammed Patel, and then we'll have Chere Munaisa, they spelled that incorrectly. And then we'll have Simbarashe Mhaka as well as Nothembi Mahlangu doing the last presentation. And then as part of the process, we will have Galo. I know I should know this by now, but I'm not going to try pronouncing your surname. So we will have Galo as our discussant for today's session. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time telling you about, the transition, decarbonization, and coal. I think everyone that's in this room knows, what's happening. But I do think that this is an important session given the interlinkages and how dependent as a country we are on coal and how that would then affect workers in the coal value chain, but in the economy more broadly. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to go through the ground rules and then we'll take the first presentation. So I'm going to request that colleagues stick to the allocated time so that we have that 5-minute buffer. If we can do that, then I'll be able to take 1 question after each presentation. So I'll try to keep it as democratic as possible. We'll do 1 question in the room for the first presentation, move online for the next presentation, and then we'll keep rotating until the last presentation. And then we will have a broader Q&A at the end of the presentations once we've had our discussant come to share his thoughts. So without any further delay, Chere, I think we would like to start with you. Once you have gone through your presentation, then we will move on to Muhammed. So while Chere gets himself ready, I would just like to say Chere joined TIPS in 2025. He is part of the Just Transition Labour Center, and his presentation will be focusing on the attitudes and perceptions of coal workers towards the just transition. Do you have your presentation ready? All right, sure.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I won't waste time. Like Nokwanda said, I'm Chere Monisa. I'm with the Just Transition Labour Center, and I'm just presenting a desktop study on what are coal workers and coal miners are saying around the just transition in South Africa. And so, broadly speaking, when it comes to the just transition in South Africa, some of the questions that we can broadly agree on is how can the South African transition to a low carbon society provide while providing economic opportunities for most vulnerable, and how can stakeholders ensure a just transition to a low carbon economy in South Africa? And trade unions are arguably one of the most critical stakeholders in making sure that the transition from coal is just in South Africa. And in the history of coal mining in South Africa, we've had a lot of centralized bargaining where coal miners have negotiated through the Mining Collective Bargaining Council, and also post-democracy, the new government established NETLEC, where labor participates in influencing economic policy. And when it comes to issues of the just transition, select trade unions are presented in the Presidential Climate Change Commission. And also outside of that, so the federations NACTU, COSATU, FEDUSA, and SAFTU have joined to form the Joint Just Transition Labour Center. So my presentation will be looking at how the trade unions have responded to the transition from coal. There'll be a brief overlook of how the federations are doing it and also the attitudes and responses of unions. Then I'll just show a snap table of different attitudes and reactions of workers. And then also recap again on the issue of the role of unions in the just transition policies, which is at NETLAC PCC and also workplaces, and also just looking at the impact of the just energy transition partnerships and the just energy transition investment plans, and also the state of collective bargaining, and also just end with a few takeaways. COSATU was one of the first federations in South Africa to develop an explicit just transition policy, even though the history of and the phrase just transition was developed by trade unions in the 70s, but actively in South Africa, COSATU was the first federation to adopt an explicit policy for just transition. And so the COSATU describes the just transition as a concept that aims to address how transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy can occur in a manner that is fair and just and inclusive economy. And some of the key principle of this is that it cannot take place without including workers and placing people at the center. And also it acknowledges that most workers in the coal value chain are semi-skilled and do not have a matric. And so it becomes a challenge as to when we talk about reskilling for the renewable energy, how is this reskilling going to come? What platforms are we going to use? If we're talking about people who are semi-skilled and some, not all of them have a matric, and a matric does not automatically guarantee access into a university or certain college diploma. So it becomes an important question when you talk about the just transition and reskilling. But beyond just the workplace, it is also an opportunity for deeper transformation of the economy. South Africa, with our history of colonialism and apartheid and now persistent socio-economic inequalities, the question when it comes to just transition for a union like for a federation like COSATU is about deeper socio-economic transformation, about redistributive power, changing the power of who owns what and who controls what when it comes to whatever tools and assets are going to be needed to participate in the just on a green economy. And when it comes to coal mine areas, workers and small businesses and communities are the most vulnerable, just beyond your immediate coal mine employees. And also, which leads to the thing of the question of unplanned and energy transitions, unplanned mine closures that happen only from a company perspective, where the company decides on its own with the board members and maybe bargains with coal mine unions and coal mine workers under auspices of the LRA, but not applying the broader implications of socio-economic risk that would apply to people outside of the immediate employ of the mine. So that's why unplanned transition. And also COSATU goes as far as including the issues of gender when it comes to mining affected communities, because the mining value chain employs more men. Only about 13% of women, of the employees in the coal mining value chain are women. And also, when we move into this transition, as we talk about it, it must provide for economic diversification and regional economic development of coal towns. So we're talking about Mpumalanga. Mpumalanga, I know if you've been there, you know it also has quite a lot of farms, and it's also a tourist attraction. There is opportunity for diversification when you talk about Mpumalanga. And moving on to FEDUSA, FEDUSA adopted its policies for just transition in 2018. And in 2021, the President, Jack Hugo, released a statement saying, acknowledging that climate action is a trade union issue and that unions have a vital role to play in protecting jobs, existing workplaces and industries, and demanding industrial transformation to organize quality jobs. So FEDUSA is not so strong about economic transformation, but it is still clear, and it says that you must not leave no one behind, and it believes that it is for the mining companies to play a role within the low carbon economy, in the just transition, and with the providing, for example, like providing metals and minerals that are needed to construct and manufacture technologies. Europe and America, even China, are paying more interest to countries in Africa with metals and minerals that are needed for all these electric vehicles, batteries and things like that. And coal can still be part of the energy mix as we transition. So similar to COSATU, where there's a concern of unplanned and immediate closure of coal mines, FEDUSA is in favor of gradual close down of coal mines. So they don't support the opening up of new power stations beyond Medupi and Kusile, but they don't want an immediate and unplanned or uncontrolled shutdown of coal mines. And they believe that there should be active labor market policies that go along with the transition. For example, job training and placement schemes. There must be databases that are developed locally or specifically of coal mine workers who will be affected by the transition. And also job training and placement center must be available. So this would imply that government and the coal mining companies must make sure that these things are happening along with retraining for jobs and income support during the transition. It will be unemployment insurance, social grants, and comprehensive social security. This can then be implying that we're going beyond the coal mines. We're also looking at neighboring communities, surrounding communities that depend on coal mines, either directly because their parents work in the mines or they've got some informal businesses going on, and even support for the small businesses and micro businesses that have developed around the towns that are there, and explicitly training out of labor, transition of labor forces, early retirement, voluntary packages. But this must form part of this shift away from, okay, it's not moving. Similarly, SAFTU also has its own policies when it comes to the just transition and its own demands, is that the discussion on the just transition cannot be separated from the debate on development. As I go on, you start to see there's a bit of a theme that we have to make sure that there is development, and development is part of what is happening. Also, it links a bit with the history of apartheid and colonialism and persistent inequality in the current state. And the struggle should be for a sustainable future, which is then that where everybody and different sectors can continue to earn an income, even if you are no longer, even if you are from a fuel industry like coal or oil and other polluting industry, and protecting distinct groups of workers such as those directly employed in the coal mining in this situation. And also it goes beyond in acknowledgement of the impact of moving away from coal, suggesting that we must act alongside other social movements like Mekua, which is a mining towns an NGO that works with communities in the mining towns. And once again, similar to COSATU, it calls for using the just transition as a chance to make a socio-economic transformation. And more recently, as part of the new president under Cyril Ramaphosa, the efforts to bring energy stability and reduce corruption and things like that, one of the major proposals that they are implementing has been the breaking up of ESCOM into different components so that it's easier to manage. This was rejected by SAFTU. And at a presentation at the Just Transition School of Labor and Urban Studies, Zwelinzima Mavavi released a statement saying, "We, the climate movement and trade union movement, can no longer afford to endorse the central premise of so-called liberal business establishment on the mainstream of big green NGOs and of market-focused think tanks." And this is a response to the feeling that right now, just transition, and particularly the transition from coal in South Africa, is being pushed by interest in the private sector, privatizing energy production and meeting the demands of organizations that are funding South Africa and big green NGOs that are just pushing for outright greening of economies without consideration of the socio-economic impacts of if a mine was to close immediately. And then I move on to looking at the specific select unions within the coal workers section, starting with the NUM. Recently, I think it was 2024, the General Secretary released a statement saying South Africa is going to lose jobs in the coal sector, but not gain them in renewables. We are not going to be dictated to. You in the West are wasting your time. We are a country that must do our things our own way at our own pace. The unions are calling for more time to provide workers and communities most directly impacted by potential job losses to deliberate and set in place a viable, just alternative. As the union that is most directly impacted, it's because NUM is still the biggest organizer of coal workers in the country. It's been actively defending the coal workers and coal mines, and even supporting the expansion of coal mines, proposing and promoting cleaner energy technologies like carbon capture and things like that. Even from the early 2009s, when COSATU started developing just transition policies, NUM was always on the defensive, and going on to say that old coal, even going as far as suggesting that all coal-fired stations can be rebuilt to extend their lives. And they are very explicit in their opposition that it feels like it is imperialism being imposed on South Africa because they believe that the demand or highly pressured demand that you must move away from coal is coming from external funders, which will be your USA and your Europe and your UK. And from the National Congress of 2022, looking at specifically some of the resolutions and issues they highlighted, was the concern about the immediate cease of coal use, which would mean loss of employment, loss of membership, and also loss of livelihoods, which I've touched on. How much time do I still have? Okay, a minute. Okay, so essentially NUM is opposed to a rapid and unplanned transition from coal, but it is not opposed to the just transition. It's just insisting that it must be done, asking questions like, is South Africa aiming to achieve zero emissions or net zero emissions? Those kind of questions that it still has and feels like they need to be answered. What is the appropriate mix of energy? And NUMSA was another federation through its organizing of workers in ESCOM. Initially, NUMSA was one of the most progressive unions in explicitly adopting policies that embrace the just energy transition and renewable energy. But their call is for socially owned renewable energy. Almost as soon as they had adopted their policies of the just transition, they had issues with government, not with the calls for a just transition or for renewable energy, but with how government was doing it. And even in 2018, Carl Clouthier, the then Deputy Secretary, had to write an article to remind people that they are committed to a socialist vision of renewable energy, not a capitalist vision. One of the more recent statements released under the name of Ivan James states, when it was not fashionable to defend ESCOM, NUMSA had been very consistent that we need a just transition, which is about making sure that we retain existing jobs while we embark on aggressive campaign to create much needed jobs. So I think it's coming out that even here, NUMSA is also as well opposed to saying that they feel that our pace, our current desired pace, is due to the pressure that is coming from northern donors. And even when it comes to AMCU, which also organizes a number of coal mines and collieries in Mpumalanga, their statement is clear. We know we must shift from coal-fired power plants. Okay, so even AMCU is on the same tape. Like last year, there was a campaign against Seriti mines, which is planning to retrench and close a few of their mines. And Matunja rejected it strongly, talking about you as South Africa with the lousy 1.2 and other countries contribute about 13.5% into global CO2 emissions. And some of the, okay, now I guess I'll answer some of the questions as we speak, but essentially trade unions are still in support of the just transition. That is why part of it is being seen them being part of the JTLC. Thank you.
Thank you, Chere. Colleagues, we will share the presentation. So if you're worried about not having seen the rest of the slides, do not be concerned. So I will take a question, a quick one, if there's one in the room. Otherwise, I think we can probably move on to the next presentation. Question in the room? No? All right. All right, so we will take Muhammed then, who is going to present the coal vulnerability assessment. I think everyone knows Muhammed, so I will not introduce him. You have 15 minutes.
15 minutes.
Yeah.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to everyone for joining us, both here physically in our meeting room and online. You know, before I jump into my presentation, you know, the presentation is on the coal value chain, and it says NEVA update. So just a bit of some context. NEVA stands for those that don't know, the National Employment Vulnerability Assessment. It's the first part of essentially a two-stage framework of analysis that's defined quite early on in the 2011 National Climate Change Response White Paper. And the whole idea of conducting this analysis is to identify vulnerabilities, specifically as a result of climate change on our economy, and to formulate policy proposals to mitigate those impacts from climate change. The central focus, and the chapter that it appears in is around employment mitigation. So employment, protecting job loss is sort of front and center of the analysis, just so that you have that backdrop. TIPS had conducted an earlier version of the NEVA SJRPs around 2019, 2020, and now we're in the process of updating those NEVAs. It was, you know, the previous NEVAs were pre-COVID and were before a lot of the disruption in global energy markets that we've seen. So this work is an essential update to that vulnerability assessment. And in the months that follow, we'll be developing the SJRPs, which are the policy proposals that are developed on the basis of the highlighted vulnerabilities. So just a bit of context around that before I jump in. So the slide essentially summarizes what I've just said. The last point there is that coal has always been a hot sector or value chain of interest since the beginning of just transition discussions. I mean, the reason is obvious to some, maybe not obvious to others, but coal is one of the most destructive energy sources that we have. And when we burn it, it releases carbon dioxide in quantities much greater than other types of energy sources that we have. Additionally, there's other environmental and pollution effects that are associated with it. So it's always been a hot topic when we talk about decarbonization, and it's always been a hot topic, particularly in South Africa, when we talk about decarbonization and just transition, because coal is so central to our economy and our economic fabric. So before I jump into the vulnerability assessment, this schematic just basically gives an overview of the coal value chain in South Africa. Very simply, we start at the coal mining stage, and you know, coal is mined from the ground either through underground mining or surface mining. Over time, there's been a bit of a transition towards a greater reliance on open cast or surface mining. And you know, looking at sort of the average over 2022 to 2024, we have around 238 megatons of coal that's produced in the country. And so just to clarify, most of the coal in the country is thermal coal, so used for power generation, feeding Sasol's petrochemicals production. We don't take into account coking coal, which is used in steel making. A lot of that is imported into the country and is produced in very limited quantities in the country. So off that amount, roughly, over 50% is consumed by Eskom and Sasol domestically. So they're a main key downstream consumer. And then we have domestically a smaller amount that feeds into other industries like steel, cement, etc. Export a key component of the industry as well. So about 16% in volume terms gets exported. But typically the higher grade coal is exported to our traditional markets. Now, in the post-COVID period, and when there was subsequent, regrowth in economies recovering, as well as some of the global energy tensions that we've seen, the Russia-Ukraine war, for example, there was a bit of a scatter and a mix and a diversification of the export market, but it was very short-lived. And our export market has now sort of roughly returned to its pre-COVID state, in the sense that we still have India as a traditional key off-taker, Pakistan, South Korea, also important importers of South African coal. Another point of interest is when we think about logistics, because it has an importance on the performance of the industry. Domestically, most of the coal is transported via coal truckers or conveyor belts. If one takes a drive through some of the coal municipalities in Mpumalanga, you can see that trucks use these roads because they're completely devastated by the coal trucking. When we talk about the export line, typically most of the export coal runs from Mpumalanga to Richards Bay Coal Terminal. And that occurs via the Transnet rail line. And in recent history, poor performance on that infrastructure has actually held back domestic miners from profiting on increased global demand for coal in that post-COVID period. Okay, so I said we're worried about employment. So what is the employment picture? In 2024, total coal mining employed around 100,000 employees, according to information from DMRE and Minerals Council. About 86% of these employees are housed within Mpumalanga. So Mpumalanga is our coal hotspot, as is well known. And this picture hasn't changed much since the previous NEVA. In that sense, Mpumalanga is still where our coal intensity lies. We went through an exercise of trying to figure out exactly the amount of employees that are linked to coal. So, firms don't always report it this way. So there's a bit of, stacking up of workers in different divisions. Almost all Eskom workers in generation are aligned towards coal based on Eskom's technology. Sasol has around 13,000 employees that are linked to coal. This is likely slightly underrepresenting the true exposure, because there are back staff in head offices, etc., that are also linked to coal activities. So the true number is probably a bit higher than that. In terms of importance of some of these key downstream coal consumers, coal mines contributed around 4 billion in mineral royalties in 2024. Sasol contributed, around a similar amount in 2024. When we talk about the geographical concentration and the specific local municipalities, the picture is still largely the same from the earlier NEVA. So it's 4 key coal municipalities: Emalahleni, Steve Tshwete, Governor Mbeki, and Msukaligwa. We've also included Sasolburg here in the analysis, given the linkages, with Sasol's overall performance. If we see reductions in coal demand and a decline in coal activity, this is going to have ripple effects across the company and across the production sites. So as an addition to this NEVA, we've included Sasolburg as well. Importantly, and this is a feature we see in a lot of coal regions throughout the world, and it's well documented in the literature, is that coal regions have certain qualities about them. right? They have a coal mining identity, and it was mentioned by Chere, I think, earlier on. You have family members and successive generations that work in coal mines, and there's a sort of coal identity. My father worked in a coal mine, my grandfather worked in a coal mine. This is sort of our culture. So that's prevalent within Mpumalanga. But also importantly is this idea of a mono economy or a high economic reliance on the coal value chain, directly and indirectly. So coal value chain activities account for directly the people that are working at the Eskom power mines or the people that are working at the Secunda power plant, the people that work for the companies that supply inputs into those big power plants. But then indirectly, we also have a lot of effects, right? So a lot of allied economic activities are linked to the coal value chain for their survival. So here we talk about retail, food services, accommodation, even informal businesses like spaza shops that are outside the mines that serve the employees of the mines working there, all rely on essentially coal value chain activity. So the big risk, and it's well known, is that when you pull coal out from a region where it's so fundamental and important, what happens to everything else? And we want to prevent a situation that has been viewed historically as sort of that ghost town archetype, right? You leave the town to decay culturally and socially if all these activities are removed. And that's not really a context I think we aspire to as a country, given our socioeconomic context. So just to also provide a contextual view as to what's going on within the coal value chain and some of the dynamics that we can think about. So firstly, we've had, in terms of looking at the outlook for coal demand, and here I'm drawing on international institutions that do this kind of analysis, so like the IEA, the annual BP review. The demand for coal is likely to remain until the end of the decade. However, beyond that point, it's really not clear what's going to happen to the demand for coal. There are some factors to consider in terms of current geopolitical sentiment, as well as domestic issues. But from what we can tell, we have Eskom plants retiring post-2030. We have a new IRP that doesn't seem to suggest a very significant extension and coal dependency moving forward. We see pressure on key market participants to decarbonize and move away from coal. We know Sasol is involved with the whole process of changing its business model. Some of the other downstream firms like PPC aim to shift away from coal. When we look at the global demand picture, in the longer term, the sentiment is that Western countries progressively are going to reduce their coal exposure, and demand is going to likely stem from the East. So India is one of our main off-takers. So India sort of retains its demand, China possibly, but the demand from these Eastern economies is also pegged to their decarbonization pressures and their decarbonization goals, and the extent to which there's a speed or a drive towards that. So, putting a number is very hard when you're looking into the future. And, these are not predictions. They are, they're simulations. But if we work on the assumption that we retain the India demand, the China demand, but they also progressively move with their decarbonization plans, we can look at anything of between a 30 to 90% drop by 2040. Again, you don't hold me to this figure. This is the best case estimate now. No one knows what's going to happen geopolitically, what's going to happen with technological evolution, particularly around decarbonization technologies. But this is sort of what we can say from now. In terms of policy responses, we also have some pressures that push us towards decarbonization. And I'll just mention some of them briefly. From a carbon policy point of view, we've got the Climate Change Act that makes provisions for carbon budgets. We've got the carbon tax phase 2 meant to kick off from next year. These are really ringing in the noose or tightening the noose on carbon production. what happens after these policies are put in place, whether carbon production is penalized adequately, it's unclear, but those policies are in place. We also see other factors like the increase of border carbon adjustments. And so just to clarify, coal exports are not currently under the provision of what's being taxed on the CBAM, but coal serves as an important input into other value chains that are like iron and steel, for example. And also the product scope hasn't been set in stone. So it's likely and possible that that product scope could expand over time and include other products. So that increases our carbon exposure there as well. Funding is another issue, although, within India and China, you get state-sponsored coal generation, but from a global level, funding new coal is still problematic. Some of the other factors are, the extent to which local firms decarbonize and what happens with the domestic coal mining market. I mean, in the last couple of years, we've seen some of the major mining conglomerates pull away from coal. And the effect is that you get Black-owned investors now investing into production that may have a lifespan, right? So we also need to think about that from an equity perspective. A lot of the mining conglomerates were here when coal was good and profited. And now, if the writing's on the wall, they start pulling out. Black investors invest. What is the long-term plan? Are we setting up those investors for sunk costs down the line? It's a question. Okay, so the ability of firms to react and stakeholders to react differ. And I'm sorry, I know I'm going over time. I'm going to try and cut it up. Downstream coal refineries to some extent can mitigate the impact of measures to reduce emissions. So, like Eskom is considering, other types of production going into renewables. Some firms face more difficulty in doing that, like Sasol, for example. We know a lot of research work's been done around this, and Sasol's difficulty now in basically transforming Secunda. It's not clear that. So when you speak to the Sasol engineers, it's an incredibly complicated exercise to remove coal as a feedstock from Secunda and to replace it with something else. And it's not clear how that can be done and whether that can be done feasibly and who would pay for that, right? Like that also, there's issues around gas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So some firms have a more limited ability to switch or to pivot to other types of production technologies. However, the biggest vulnerabilities lie with coal miners and the communities, since a lot of them have very little scope for redirecting their core business and their skills. Chere mentioned that in one of his points that coal miners earn relatively well compared to their level of education. So that means re-employment for the same level of education, entering the rest of the formal economy becomes a problem. Quickly to sum up, the same four municipalities that I mentioned are still very highly dependent on coal, very embedded in coal, and very at risk. We also looked at different dimensions of vulnerabilities, and we will be publishing the paper, so colleagues can go through this in detail. I haven't put all of the graphs, but it just shows you the extent to which there are vulnerabilities in the system. So while mine workers and coal mine workers enjoy a high degree of unionization and support structures through UIF, etc., they still remain highly at risk given their salaries in proportion to their level of education and what's available out there in the rest of the formal economy. In the subsequent papers, we're going to be developing the policy proposals on the basis of this vulnerability analysis. Time is up. But if there's a question around that and what that might take, I'm happy to answer it in the question tab. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Muhammed. I do have a question online. In the room? Ian? Hang on, you have a question?
I have a question.
Let's see if there's anyone else that's not you that has a question, and then we will circle back. No? All right.
Thanks, Nokwanda.
You might need to come up here. Hang on. Yeah.
Thanks, Muhammed. Just a quick question from me. do all our coal mines produce varying grades of coal, or are there only mines located in particular areas in Mpumalanga and other parts of the country that produce high-grade coal?
All right, sorry, Mohammed, I just got a quick one online. Of the nearly 100,000 people employed in coal mining, does this include transport, like truckers, for example? So you can answer both questions.
Okay. So I can't comment on each colliery and the extent to which they produce export versus coal for the domestic market. However, there are, to my understanding, some collieries that produce specifically higher grade coal because those coal deposits are there. That's the best I can do. It's an interesting question. I would love to see a table of each colliery, what grade of coal they produce. I don't have that information. However, I do know that there are firms that produce coal for the export market. Right. Second question was?
Does the 100,000 include other workers like coal truck?
Yeah. So the 100,000 includes only coal mine workers. Okay. Right. So it's at that first stage, coal miners. It's an important question because it aligns with the ripple effects. So you have declines in coal activity. That means you have a reduced demand for transport, which means that the logistics firms suffer as well. We, through previous research, we identified around 2,000 truckers or so. However, that number is likely different and has possibly changed for many reasons. Since 2020 to 2025, when there were constraints along the Transnet export line, they were switching to road transport, which increased the demand for road transport. So now, instead of via conveyor belt moving your coal from Mpumalanga to Richards Bay Coal Terminal, you had many more trucks. It wasn't a perfect switch, so all the coal couldn't be feasibly switched over to road transport, but there certainly was an increase in demand for coal transport, which could have attracted new participants into the market. It's something we would. It's an important gap to fill in terms of information and vulnerability.
All right. Hamida, I see your hand, but can I please ask that you keep your question and then I will take your hand at the end of the discussant's input. All right. So that's the end of time for that segment. We are going to move on to the next presentation. And Simba, Nothembi, who's going first? Yeah. All right. So the next presentation is going to be on existing industry provisions for South African coal workers in the transition. You will have a combined 20 minutes. So you split it however you want to split it. 20 minutes, Simba.
Thank you, Program Director. I was trying to bribe here with the time. Our presentation is a bit lengthy, but we will try and make it sweet and short and cover the most important aspects. So basically, me and my colleague are going to be presenting our preliminary findings on the research that we have conducted titled Beyond the Coal Mine, Assessing Existing Industry Provisions for South African coal mine workers in a transition. So without wasting much of our time, I won't go through the introduction in detail, but essentially the question that we are trying to solve here is how can government intervene in this transition and manage it in a way that minimizes harm for the coal mine workers and maximizes potential benefits in this transition. Also, not going to speak more about the problem. I think Muhammed has covered much of that ground, but essentially what we are talking about here is the argument that we are using is designing and implementing a worker policy package for the coal mine workers that are in transition is quite complex and costly if the government has to do it alone. So what we are suggesting here is there need to be close collaboration between government and existing industry provisions. The fortunate part is South Africa is grounded with mine closure framework that can be used to protect and support coal mine workers in a transition. The key legislation that we are talking about here is the Mineral and Petroleum Resource Development Act of 2002, which requires that mining companies develop social and labor plans to protect and support workers during the life of a mine. The unfortunate part is SLPs are regarded as falling too short because of various challenges that confront them, that prevent them from making a full impact. So our research is aimed at evaluating the adequacy and effectiveness of social and labor plans, that is existing industry provisions, in meeting the needs of coal mine workers in a transition. We also look at identifying gaps and challenges that are confronting existing industry provision in delivering a full impact. Thereafter, we'll seek to provide recommendation to mitigate those challenges to ensure that existing industry provisions deliver full impact, as well as provide recommendation where government can intervene and complement existing industry provision. So in our research, we made use of document analysis. The documents that we used include SLPs for coal mining companies in Mpumalanga. We also used sustainability and ESG reports for coal mining companies, transition plans, and also company websites. We complemented that findings from document analysis with the informant interviews. We interviewed representatives from coal mining companies, as well as representatives from trade unions, as well as some just transition practitioners. We also had focus group with coal mine workers, as well as the just transition practitioners. So in this research, when we speak of coal mine workers, we're essentially referring to anyone who is working for a coal mining company, whether you are in the operations or in the support services, we regard them as coal mine workers or co-workers. So essentially those workers are at risk of job losses in this transition. So our presentation will begin with a brief presentation on the impact, the labor market position, as well as the labor market needs for coal mine workers based on different worker typologies that we have created. As this formulates the important basis to which we can evaluate the adequacy and effectiveness of existing industry provisions in South Africa. So I'll hand over to my colleague to go through the impact and needs of coal mine workers as a starting point. Thank you.
Thanks, Simba. So good morning, colleagues. I won't take much time. So we looked at the impact and needs of coal mine workers in the transition, and as my colleagues have expressed, that there are many implications for the coal workers. So we looked at the 4 dimensions of financial impact, social capital, human capital, and also physical capital. Financial impacts being loss of wages, non-wage benefits, just to mention a few, and then also capital, social capital, looking at loss of identity, looking at the increased loneliness, stress, and depression, and also the rise of GBV in the communities, and also looking at the human capital, looking at the loss of job-specific skills, and also reduced retraining opportunities and the decline of employability, just to also mention a few there, and also looking at the physical capital, loss of housing, loss of deterioration of basic services, looking at water, electricity, waste management, and also loss of community facilities such as recreational spaces and community halls and etc. And okay, so we also looked at what the coal workers' needs are, and looking at the worker typology according to the older workers and also younger workers, and also we looked at the age, skills, and also their position in the labor market. So just to go through some of the advantages for all the qualified workers, they have experience and also bargaining power and also potential for mentoring roles, but they do have a disadvantage of higher wage expectations and less attractiveness to new employers. And then also looking at the low low qualified workers, older workers, they do have long tenure and may offer severance benefits, but they do have a disadvantage of less limited education and training, and also low digital literacy. And then just to summarize some of their needs, this was complemented by the interviews that we held. So we looked at the needs that they do need: retirement planning, healthcare support after the closure of the mines, targeted reskilling, and also literacy programs. This is due to the packages that they receive after the closure of the mines. They do need literacy programs, and just community-based employment. There is more needs that they do require, but yeah, this is just to summarize a few of the points. And then looking over to the younger workers, for qualified, they do have an advantage of transferable skills and also higher adaptability and mobility, but they do have a disadvantage of lack of sector-specific experience. And then also looking at the lower qualified workers, younger, this being an advantage of being flexible and also willingness to train, retrain, and also lower wage expectations. But they do have a disadvantage of limited formal qualification and also unstable employment history. And just to mention a few of their needs, they do need training, advanced training, and also job placement services, and also some of the vocational training. And the idea here is just to understand what the needs are of the workers and whether the industry provisions really address their needs. So I'll just hand over to my colleague to take us through the SLP, the social and labor plans components, and also the frameworks and the assessment of the industry provisions. Thank you.
All right, to continue, like I've said before, designing and implementing a worker policy package for coal mine workers in transition is quite complex and costly if the government has to do it alone. That underscores the need for government to collaborate with the industry in developing a worker policy package. So the good thing is South Africa have got strong legislation to protect workers during operation and during closure of coal mines. The one legislation that we are using again is the Mineral and Petroleum Resource Development Act, which requires that mining companies provide social and labor plans for their co-workers during the life of a mine. So essentially, a social and labor plan is a document that outlines, among others, mine commitments to their workers. So a social and labor plans consist of sections such as strategies to ensure human resource development for the workers and the community members, but here we are focusing on the workers only. The SLP also consists of strategies to ensure mine community economic development. It also consists of strategies for managing downscaling and retrenchment for coal mine workers. And then the last section is the financial provision for undertaking all other sections of the SLP. So these are some of the legislation. Besides the Mineral and Petroleum Resource Development Act, these are some of the legislation and guidelines that support the development of social and labor plans. Just to mention a few, and its relevance to just transition. If you look at Labor Relations Act, it protects workers' rights to collective bargaining and consultation. That is very important for procedural justice. If you look at Skills Development Act, it requires that companies support ongoing training and education, and that is very important for distributive justice in this transition. To start with, before we go to assessing the adequacy and effectiveness of existing industry provision, there are some important elements that we saw in the SLPs that needs to be used or considered for policy design. As an example, employment. We did assess the level of employment in each coal mine and the type of employment in each coal mine. Our findings are that coal mine employment varies across different mines. For the smallest operations, they employ around 300 workers, and the largest operations employ around up to 8,000 workers. The type of employment in coal mines typically consists of permanent workers, fixed-term workers, as well as workers employed by external service providers, that is mining contractors. The good thing is majority of employment in coal mining industry is permanent workers. On average, there is one contractor worker per every 3 full-time worker or permanent worker. That suggests greater employment stability as well as access to full-time benefits. So if you read our report, the mining companies that we have used their SLPs, we try to code them using alphabetical letters for research purposes. However, when you go down the report, you'll see that we made some examples of actual names of coal mining companies. That doesn't mean that those are coal mining companies that we used in the SLPs, but that information, we found it in their website or other reports that are online. Therefore, we have referenced that. The other important element in the SLP for policy consideration in this just transition is the labor sending regions. So in our assessment for labor sending areas, we realized, as you know, from section 41 part C of the Minerals and Petroleum Resource Development Act, it requires that mining companies support socioeconomic development through creation of local employment. So what that means is mining companies should prioritize community members when they are hiring. So in the assessment of labor sending regions, we realized that majority of core workers are coming from Mpumalanga. Remember, these are SLPs, we assessed SLPs from Mpumalanga. So about 84% of the workers are coming from Mpumalanga. That suggests that there may be limited labor mobility out of Mpumalanga. So there is need to develop local employment alternatives for Mpumalanga. About 13% are coming from other South African provinces, which is mainly Gauteng, Limpopo, KZN, and Eastern Cape. Those workers might need to relocate back to their home areas, suggesting that they may need some relocation assistance. And about 3% of the workers are foreign nationals, coming from countries such as Mozambique, Malawi, Lesotho, and Zimbabwe. The challenge that we saw in the SLP for reporting of the labor sending regions is the underreporting of outsourced workers. That may risk overlooking the relocation needs for the outsourced workers and complicate the design of a targeted worker policy package for those outsourced workers that might want to return back to their home areas. Another important element that we saw that is reflected in the SLPs is the education levels of coal mine workers. As you know that education levels is used as a proxy for skills, although sometimes misleading because higher education does not always translate into industry-ready skills, in particular in the lens of green economy skills. But it still remains a good indicator for where reskilling, upskilling, or direct transfer is needed. So we assess the education levels of coal mine workers. Essentially, majority of the workers are within the further education training band. That is, they have got grade 10 to grade 12. And 25% of the workers have got higher education and training. They've got at least a diploma or higher. And 11% from the assessed SLPs falls within general education and training. That is, they've got up to grade 9. So the good news is, from the mining companies, they have reported that they're increasingly making grade 12 as a minimum entry requirement. That suggests maybe the reason why those that are within general education and training are low. Now, after that, we also looked at company compliance to Skills Development Act, which requires that mining companies support ongoing skills, ongoing training and education. So we realized that most of the mining companies through their SOPs complies with skills development legislation in the sense that they've hired a skills development facilitator that oversees training. They submit annually a workplace skills plans and an annual training reports. They're also registered with the Mining Qualification Authority, which is the mining SETA. They also make contributions to the skills development. They also make contributions of the skills development levy, which is 1% of total employee earnings. Some other companies goes beyond compliance. As an example, Mine A, they allocate 5% over and above the 1%. They allocate it towards critical skills development. We also tried to assess what type of infrastructure do mining companies use when they are training their workers. We realized that mining companies make use of a range of physical and soft infrastructures. As an example, Mine A, B, D, and G, they have their own training centers that have acquired training provider status from the MQA. And many mining companies make use of digital platforms for training of their workers. As an example, Exaro make use of My Next e-learning platform for training purposes. The challenge that we have seen under this part is that most of the training programs that are offered, especially the ones that are offered through digital platforms, are not accredited. The other challenge is when mining companies are making use of external service providers that are registered by MQA, most of the training service providers focus on mining-related skills training. And also mining companies reported that when they use MQA-registered training providers, some of them are profit-driven, so they require more people but with less impact. We also try to assess collaborations when they are offering skills development programs. What type of collaboration do they use? We realize that there is some form of collaboration between mining companies, but with selected stakeholders. As an example, Exaro, Tungela, Glencoe, and Seriti collaborate with Collier Training College. But the challenge in this section is that mine-to-mine collaboration remains limited. So there's no way where mine company says we collaborate with a neighboring mine for skills development. And mine to government in the lens of green economy training still remains limited. Then here we assess the individual training initiatives that mining companies are using during operation. Mining companies are making use of adult education training, learnership, bursaries, and other skills training. With regards to adult education training, it is offered to those that are regarded as functionally illiterate. So half of the coal mines are offering AET. The mines that are not offering AET reported that they either do not have eligible workers or workers have no interest to AET. So they reported that mine workers, especially those that are near retirement, they are very reluctant in taking AET, preferring job-ready skills or sometimes preferring stipends to take on this training. So there is poor uptake. Learnership. Many mining companies offer learnership programs, but the problem here is they are narrowly focused to course-specific skills. And this learnership, although they enable workers to gain a nationally recognized qualification, they are only offered mostly to permanent workers, excluding outsourced workers. And that is a risk. In terms of bursaries, majority of mining companies offer bursaries or some form of in-house study assistance for their workers. The challenge in this case that we have seen is the bursaries are offered to permanent workers and excluding outsourced workers. That means they leave outsourced workers at risk. The bursaries are also offered to workers that meets a certain academic requirement, which means they exclude workers that have got low academic qualifications. And also some companies requires repayment if mine workers do not finish their program, and that repayment limits participation to these bursary programs. Other skills development programs, these ones, they include outsourced workers, but they're mostly compliance-based. And other type of programs, they are business training and management training. They are only offered to permanent management staff, excluding everyone else that is not in management. And that is a gap. Still doing well on time. We also looked at, okay, thank you. All right. So we also looked at what are type of benefits are offered by mining companies during operations that workers may lose after closure. So we realized that mining companies are offering a range of benefits to their mine workers, which includes counseling, which includes financial training, medical aid, and housing. The only challenge from our assessment in the SOPs is mining companies do not outline how these benefits will continue or what benefits will continue post-mine closure. But we all know that probably majority of the benefits are going to be lost after closure. In terms of employees' housing support, historically, we know that employees used to depend on houses provided by their mining companies. But the good thing here is many mining companies have shifted away from that model and they now promote employee housing ownership. So many companies are providing housing allowance for their employees to live in sustainable communities. Some are even providing land subsidies and bulk services to ensure housing ownership for their employees. If you look at Tungela reported that by 2023, 99% of their workers owned their own houses. So despite of this progress, challenges still remain. Challenges remain in the sense that if mine closure or retrenchment happen before home loan repayment is complete or before building project is complete, that the workers remains at risk. The other challenge is that these benefits are offered to permanent workers, excluding outsourced workers. So outsourced workers will remain at risk. The other challenge that we saw here is that in the mining companies that are offering, that are still offering mining villages, it is said that the dependents, the old dependents, remain staying in the housing villages after closure. And in the event that the mine comes and demolishes their house, the dependents are left homeless and left with no choice than to move into informal settlements. And that is a policy gap where municipality may need to intervene. Mechanism to prevent job loss. There are many mechanisms to prevent job loss, starting with the consultation. Mining companies are required by law to consult with their workers. So they make use of future forums to facilitate dialogue with the workers, and that is an important element for procedural justice. The only challenge with consultation is sometimes it excludes outsourced workers, sometimes they exclude non-unionized workers, undermining the need for open representative and unrepresentative democracy. Sometimes they do not meaningfully consult with the municipalities and labor-sending regions. Other mechanisms to prevent job losses where job losses can be saved includes the reduction of working hours, the abolishing of overtime, strict vacancy management. But those strategies are also not good, because if you reduce working hours, that means you're reducing workers' productivity and workers' incomes that they are used at. When it comes to managing closure, when it comes to supporting workers when job losses are unavoidable, the good thing that we saw is a lot of mining companies does acknowledge is that at some point in time, besides the life of a mine, we may be forced to prematurely close as a result of many reasons. So with regards to energy transition, some big mining companies are already investing into diversifying their business, such as Seriti. Seriti have established Seriti Green, including the acquisition of wind lab to develop renewable energy projects. So if these projects are well coordinated and supported, they can help with preserving jobs. These ones, I know this slide is busy, but these are mechanisms that are used by mining companies to support workers in the event that mine closure is inevitable. So they make use of redeployments, they support self-employment programs, they make use of re-employment programs, portable skills training, severance pay, and other support services. But the challenges with 1 or 2 years, such as redeployments, redeployment strategies are often unrealistic. They are speaking of redeployments, but they don't speak in the SOP how they will do it, actually. They don't speak how they will cover relocation costs. It looks like they don't consider the energy transition, that because they want to redeploy the workers to other mines, what if with this energy transition, there's an accelerated decline of coal mine activities? That means the opportunities to redeploy the workers will also shrink. They also don't consider the local equity tension, because they speak about redeploying workers to other communities, to other sites in other communities, but there may be tension with the community members in those sites. With re-employment programs are also overly optimistic, in the sense that they are also not considering the current energy transition. With severance package by law, it is 1 week's remuneration of each year worked. That is grossly inadequate for the workers, especially considering the rise in living cost and the labor market uncertainty. And also, it's very little for those that are already less paid. Okay, so, all right. The challenges. So the challenges, I've already spoken about the challenges of SOPs and industry provisions. But just to summarize them, there is, in the design phase, we saw that there is lack of meaningful worker consultation, there is institutional disconnect and exclusion of municipalities, and there's lack of uniformity in SOP provision. So the DMRA provides a guideline of submission of SOP, but it looks like some companies follow that word to word without realistically outlining how the implementation plan and the practicality of those measures. In terms of implementation measures, we have governance gaps, weak coordination. For the worker side, we have poor uptake, a lot of dropouts. We also have the problem of profit-driven external service providers. We also have training that is linked to workers' preference, but without linking it to labor demand. from the enforcement side, the main challenge in the enforcement phase is the non-delivery of SOP commitments and also poor access to SOPs. And then I think these are the challenges. And the last slide is essentially the recommendations. We will share the recommendations, but thank you for now.
All right. Thanks, colleague. So Simba used up his 5 minutes of questions at the end. So we'll take those at the end of the discussants' inputs. Gelo, would you like to come up, please? Again, I think everybody in the room and online knows Gelo, but for those who do not, Gelo Chere is a co-founding director of Southern Transitions. He previously worked at TIPS. Please, you have your time.
Okay, great. Since I'm the only one without a PowerPoint, hopefully I should stick to time. Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here and yeah, to be back at TIPS for this event. It's really a pleasure. There was a lot of richness, I think, in what was presented this morning, and I think I want to start with, I think, a little bit of an anecdote, speaking to one of the points that Muhammed made, which is around, I think, that effectively this inherent coal identity that we are trying to grasp and manage. You know, a few months ago, I was down in a underground coal mine in Mpumalanga, one of the few ones, done 80 meters, and the company took us to literally the coal face, you know, where they actually mine the coal. And it was very surprising to see the excitement of the miners at the coal face. It was one of them and said, "Do you realize you're the first person in the world to see that part of the earth?" And they were really excited about that. You know, there was this really kind of discovery journey that they really were keen to take us on, and obviously they're going on every day. You know, and for me that was obviously quite surprising. You know, to be like realizing, you know, that that excitement, especially given the difficult conditions in which they work under on a daily basis. And we're trying to basically square that coal identity with a global transition that does not speak to people on the ground in any shape or form. And so that dichotomy for me is really important, that we kind of acknowledge it and see how we position our response to that. And I want to start with reflecting on, I think, the global transition, which often we forget to locate our work in. You know, what is happening in South Africa, what is happening in Mpumalanga does not happen in a silo, okay, or in a vacuum. It is part of a global ecosystem, a global transition, which is very complex. You know, we could speak about the global transition to a low carbon economy or lack thereof. Okay, and that's really important to understand that effectively, first, the transition is not happening at the pace or scale at which we need it to happen. And so the current trajectory is an economy that effectively is based on fossil fuel and continues to be based on fossil fuel. Yes, the share of renewable energy and green technology is growing, but in absolute terms, fossil fuels are actually still on the rise. And countries are trying to maintain their competitiveness in that environment. And that means two things. It means A, maintaining competitiveness in the old economy, trying to secure interest for as long as they can in the old economy. And that's the one part. And then the second part is, of course, securing their new green competitiveness in those pockets of transitions that are happening and unfolding. And both of those the norm is not a just transition. The norm is an unjust status quo in the old economy and an unjust transition in those new pockets of green competitiveness. And that has to happen really on a global scale. I think the direction of travel is relatively clear, but it is not without some degree of volatility. Of course, there's politics on a national scale and global scale that happens as administrations comes and goes. When we try to locate our domestic response, it's really important to understand, as it's been done in the NIVA and in the work that Just SA is doing and the work of the Just Transition Labour Center, to identify the vulnerabilities and the risks, but also to put, I would say, equal importance on identifying the opportunities. I've been part over the last few months of a process of developing a just transition framework for the Philippines. Very different context from here. But one of the key emphasis that the government there put on the table was saying, yes, risks, we get it. But what we want to know is where are the opportunities? And that is effectively the focus of their approach for their just transition. And so look, risk to risk, we'll deal with them. But where are these opportunities that everybody talks about? Where are those for our country? And I think from a South African perspective, we're certainly not putting enough emphasis on that. If we are real and we look in the mirror a little bit, we have not identified the opportunities to a degree that they are disaggregated enough and they are concrete enough to be implemented. Yes, we have a good idea at a high level of where those opportunities are. And importantly for me, we need to think about it from a whole of society and whole of economy perspective. The best solution for the coal fields in South Africa is overall job creation in the country. Okay, that's number one, to be honest. It's not a solution that's specific for Msangalinga or Emalasheni. It's actually economic development and growth in the country. That is the best solution. First off, And so we need to really put that back into our context, I think. And yes, it is important to look, of course, at regional solutions to understand some of those impacts. But here we need to be a lot more disaggregated as well. The temporal view matters a lot. And it's not easy to get that temporal view in terms of understanding that in the medium term, actually, most of the current activities are going to carry on. But there are some particular sites that are going to be impacted in the short term. And we need to really be clear about identifying these sites. Power plants, mines, refineries, smelter, doesn't matter what those are. And that we have a dedicated response for those. But for the bulk of the transition, it's quite clear from what was presented from Muhammed that, we are talking over a period of 1, 2, if not 3 decades of a transition. In addition, we need to have that comprehensive response. I think we spend a lot of time, certainly in the work that's been presented, looking at labor market policies and the response tied to workers. And of course, that's a really important side of the story. But we do know that labor market policies do work best when A, there is economic growth and employment creation, and B, when they are extremely well crafted to be very reactive to developments in the job market, if not proactive. And so, the question is retraining for what? Reskilling for what? And we come back to the need to create jobs in the economy, not just in Mpumalanga or in the coal fields. We need to create jobs in the economy. That's really what's important. And be realistic about what the opportunities are, I think, going forward. Is the most likely job for a coal miner a renewable energy job? Not really. The most likely job for a coal miner is another mining job. That's the most likely one in another commodity. Okay. For someone working in a power station, yes, then probably a shift to renewable energy is a lot easier. But we have to be realistic about some of those jobs. Again, though, there is a temporal view. If we're talking about a transition of 20 years, many of these workers will retire. And so how do we manage that? Importantly for me, it is trying to get a degree of coherence between the multiplicity of transitions that is happening. If we look at it in a very crude way, there are two transitions happening. One at the energy level and one at the economic level. Energy level is quite clear. We're trying to move from high carbon to low carbon. To be crude, from coal to renewable energy. That's one process. From an economic perspective, of course, we are trying to move from an unjust high carbon economy to a more inclusive low carbon economy. But the response to these two transitions is not one response. And I think often we try to have the same response for both. Whereas we do need to manage the electricity transition and the shift in our energy supply industry and our electricity sector, but we need to manage separately the transition to our economy. And that's a lot more comprehensive, of course, in terms of the transition that needs to happen. And that requires us to, of course, be a lot more propositional. And we've seen it, in the presentation from Chere, unions are still a little bit on the back foot when it comes to transition. Yes, they are the origin of the concept, and there's a force in that. But we need to be on the force of the proposals in terms of what needs to happen rather than protecting the old. In countries that have been very successful in accelerating the transition, actually, that's where trade unions demanded that transition to be accelerated. As I draw to a close, because you can see Nokwanda is going to jump on me very soon, we need to have a bit of coherence as well in terms of our economic strategy. And here, one question I have, and I'll be keen to hear the reflections from the group, is what is South Africa's coal strategy, actually? The RRP does look at a somewhat expansion of our coal-fired power plant lifespan. Coal has been identified as one of the 5 top priority critical minerals for the country. That clashes against our climate commitments and, of course, our just transition commitments. And so that clarity of purpose is lacking in some way. And for me, that is important because on the other side, our clarity in terms of our, if you can call it that, our green economy strategy is similarly, not coming as strongly as it could. We want to move to renewable energy, that's quite clear, but jobs are in the operation and the maintenance, in the manufacturing, and in the broader value chain. Efforts to do that job creation are stalled at the moment. And so I guess to close, the question we have here is, what do we want the legacy of coal to be for South Africa? A legacy of social and environmental impact and of ghost towns, or a legacy which says, well, look, it has some damage, but it was a springboard towards a job-rich, more inclusive, and low-carbon economy going forward. that is, I think, one of the questions that we're all trying to answer. And I think I'll close on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Galo. All right, so what we are going to do now is I will read out some questions that we've been receiving from online, and then I will ask Hamida to ask the question they had and take some answers. Then we'll move on to a Q&A after that, starting in the room. So the first question is from Richard, and I believe it is for Chere, which would be, Richard would like to get some reflections in terms of the positioning of unions, sort of contrasting that with COSATU's policy paper from 2011. Would it be fair to say there has been a retreat from the positioning of 14 years ago and a growing deference to energy incumbency? Okay, so that's the first one. The second one would be, just give me a second, third, that's three. Right, so the second one is for Muhammed, and that's from Matlotlo. Is an update in terms of railway as a form of transportation to RBTC. Have there been any improvements in rail infrastructure? Right, the next one from Ulindi was also for you, Mohammed, which is what is the outlook of major coal importers, including South Korea, India, and Pakistan, regarding continued demand in light of global pressure to decarbonize? Right, almost there. So this one from Lindy is, can the panel comment on Komati Power Station closure? Are there lessons that we can learn from arguably one of the flagships of South Africa's just transition? All right, Simba, sorry, there's quite a few, but I'm just trying to get everyone to have their questions right now. So Simba and Nothembi, what you have is from Pemelo, and please comment on the training of workers at the closed Komati. Where have they landed in terms of employment post Komati? How many were trained and in which programs? Then the last one would be from Ronald, Muhammad's presentation. There seems to be a problem with decarbonizing in terms of the technology. So what could be done to ensure knowledge and technical expertise to transition the sector? Are there any major development in line with the just transition? All right, so that would be the last question. And then Hamida, please ask your question. We'll take answers after that and move on to the next questions.
Hi, moderator, without being disrespectful, do you not want to have those questions answered first? Because they were quite a mouthful and I've got a mouthful.
You've got a mouthful?
Yes.
All right, no, that's fine. We can do that. All right, so you will come after the answers, and then I think from now on, we can just ask people to raise their hands if they're online instead of me reading the questions. Thanks. Do you want to come here, rather?
Okay, this is for Richard. In terms of trade unions' position on the issues of just transition, I think they've always been conditional in the sense that COSATU being a federation, even though it initially adopted the umbrella position, it had different unions within the organization that it had to accommodate in terms of how strong a position it takes. That is why on the one side, NUM has always been strongly opposed and more defensive to the interest of coal workers. I don't think it is to say that the unions have deferred and are now just defending coal for the sake of defending coal because they think it benefits them. I think with what is happening now, with more talk of just transition in South Africa and the government accepting more funds and being more interested in acting more purposefully in the issues of just transition, they're starting to pay more attention to the implications of what it means for them and their members. So it's a defense, yes, of workers and members, but there's still not being a dismissal or a denial of the impact of climate change. It's just in response to what is happening. For example, the mistrust of government on the part of trade unions, even though they participate in NEDLAC and the PCC, is that the JET-P and the Just Energy Transition Investment Plans are being done from the presidency and are not as consultative of the processes that are happening via PCC. So in short, coal trade unions are now just really trying to start fighting for a just transition with the emphasis on just. And like Galo said, they still need to start now being more proactive on the part of labor. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm going to do my best to respond to some of the questions. So I think it was Motlotlo that asked, is there any change in the situation on Transnet and the infrastructure issues? So my understanding of the issues, and when we did the research, there were a couple of things constraining transport along that traditional line, right? Included things like vandalism to the infrastructure, cable theft, and locomotive shortage and equipment shortage. In the past, say 6 months to a year, particularly in the last 6 months, Transnet as well as other stakeholders have reported an improvement. So there's larger volumes being transported on that line to the export market. All the problems are not solved, but it has improved from the worst sort of stages it was at around sort of 2022, 2023. So to answer the question shortly, there has been an improvement in that situation. The second is, what is the outlook for major demand in some of our key export partners? So as I mentioned in the slides, forward-looking and long-term predictions of how energy markets are going to behave are very difficult, very, very difficult. The pathways that are typically planned for make a whole host of assumptions around technology costs, around where production lies, transport costs, etc. So it's quite a complicated exercise in getting into that scenario modeling. And importantly, it depends on a number of assumptions which can break, right? So for example, when we saw Russia, Ukraine, that sent energy markets into turmoil. When we saw other key geopolitical events, similar situations. So predictions are difficult. So all we can do is say on the basis of what we can see today, and assuming that some of these major importers pursue their decarbonization plans, in the long term, coal still looks like it's at risk. So while China and India do provide state-supported finance for coal production within their countries, they're also embarking quite aggressively on sustainable investments and renewable investments. So it's not the case at all that India and China are saying, we just drink coal and that's our view, and screw everything else, excuse my French. So many factors will come into play, the evolution of the technology, the extent to which some of the new and emerging technologies become viable, all have a role to play in how quickly these traditional coal consumers decarbonize and the resultant decline in demand for South African thermal coal. So that's the best of the outlook that we can say. We can say the warning signs are there: reduced demand from Western economies for coal, increased demand from Asia, but also tempered by their decarbonization ambitions. Finally, the question was, if I understood it correctly, there are issues with decarbonizing, right? So you're often talking about newer technologies, perhaps that have not reached commercial viability yet, or are not widely rolled out in South Africa, but perhaps maybe have some footprint in other countries. And what do we do about that? Yes, it's true. And obviously, there's different technologies that are different levels of technology readiness, right? And also, for a given technology, different applications have different levels of technology readiness. So, for example, if you're talking about green hydrogen and green steel, we know that there's still some way to go. And then when we contrast that with our South African economic and industrial configuration, high degree of reliance on blast furnaces, for example, with the rest being the sort of electrical intensive EAF production, then we need to think about strategic decisions that need to be made around that as well, and the extent to which these new technologies can be absorbed. Not an easy exercise, always very complicated. If you look at Sasol as well, trying to integrate green hydrogen into Sasol, not an easy exercise. A number of risks. So yes, we are at a point in time where we are moving towards more sustainable production, but that is going to involve costs and it's going to involve difficult decisions. So ultimately, yes, when we're talking about decarbonization technologies, the answer is not always clear. It's not always the case that production is going to happen, at a level that's the same as the incumbent technology. So then, how do we think about policy around that and how we can support the growth of some of these industries? The clean coal story, I know it was mentioned, it's been mentioned for a long time, who wouldn't want there to be massive decarbonization from coal use, and that story is sorted out, and then we can just extract all of our coal and use all of our coal resources. It's a nice idea, but there's many, many risks around that technology as well that need to be worked out before it can become even close to viable. Yeah, so those are my responses.
So yeah, as for me, I think I'll begin with the question on lessons learned from Komati closure. I think as far as workers are concerned, Komati closure has taught us the importance of being proactive than being reactive. The IRP outlines the mines, the plants that are going to close. We need to act now. We have a lot of coal plants that are going to close by 2050. 2050 looks like it's far, but we need to start implementing proactive training programs now, for workers to start training now, for workers that are able to move to other sectors to start moving now, so that we lessen the burden at the point of closure. That's number one. Number two, I think consultation was not given enough time. I think we really need something like a code of good practice, which depicts which shows who needs to be consulted and when consultation should begin. Number three, this one it's for me, but it's open for debate. I think we really need to start repurposing before we close down any plant. If we start repurposing that way, we can preserve jobs than to do it other way around, like close and repurpose later. So we can see now what's happening at Komati. They closed and they're trying to repurpose, but it's not really progressing very well. So I think countries like Netherlands have done the same practice where they've closed coal plants. Before closure of coal plants, they've repurposed it to a chemical business. If you want to look, you can look at a business, I think it's called the DSM, Dutch state-owned mines. So before closure of those mines, they repurposed the mining business into a chemical plant that helped with preserving employment. In terms of training happening at Komati, yes, indeed, there is training happening at Komati. They are training welding, they are training spray painting, they are training panel beating. But that is what I'm saying, that we need to be proactive. It looks like these strategies are coming often too late instead of coming before closure. So if you want to train workers at the point of closure, that is too late already, because at that point, workers are only concerned about how they will maintain their income instead of training. So that uptake already, if you go to Komati, you hear that a lot of people have already moved out. There is training, but there's a lot of dropouts because people move out because they're looking for jobs. So we need to really be proactive and start training the people way before mine closure or plant closure. And that is my contribution. Thank you.
All right, thanks, colleagues. So we will then take the mouthful from Hamida and then take questions in the room. Can you please unmute her?
Thanks very much. So I'm Hamida. I was the executive director of Naledi, and I'm currently at SATAU, which is the Transport and Allied Workers Union. So I'm speaking from a workers' perspective. And so I'd also like to turn this discussion on its head and perhaps pick up on the point that Galo made, that we need to think about this in a global context. So the just transition, which he rightly said is a Labour principle, and it's about decarbonization from high carbon to low carbon economy. Now, South Africa is the only country in Africa that has well, we would say a large carbon footprint, but globally we sit at 10 or 14 at the moment. So there's this process and pressure, I think, as Muhammed was indicating, and as well as Galo, there's a global pressure for us to decarbonize. But what people don't seem to understand, and I'd like to interrogate Muhammad's comment, you know, and as much as you've got green technologies and an investment in sustainable development or green technologies, what Galo indicated was as much as there's been green uptake, there's been no decrease in carbon. So it's very interesting. The people that are telling us, the North telling the South that we need to decarbonize. We know that in the global context of COP, we're struggling to keep the temperature to 1.5. It's probably going to be 2.8 now, noting how bad the NDC commitments from the North has been. And yet South Africa is being asked to decarbonize. We see the impact of, I mean, this whole discussion is in relation to mine workers losing their jobs, but TUED as well as KPMG have released reports that indicate that while there's been an increase...
Hamida, I'm sorry, but we're running out of time. Can you please ask your question?
Yeah, but this is really difficult. I mean, I did ask the question, but I mean, the challenge is you had so many panelists.
Hamida, please ask your question again.
So I did ask the question.
What was the question?
I did ask the question, which was in relation to there's been investment in green technologies. There's been an increase in carbon, but there's been, and the hypothesis that says there will be decarbonization if you increase in green technologies is not working. And I'm surprised that this is not coming forward in the discussion. So Muhammad was indicating he does not want to be held accountable that in the near future we will see a downward trend in decarbonization, but that there's investment in greens. And I'm saying, well, in actual fact, what's currently happening is you're seeing an increase in green technology and an increase in carbon. Secondly, in relation to labor. So, I mean, I don't know whether you want to call it defensive, but if your jobs were under attack and you were told that your jobs were going to be preserved...
Hamida, I'm sorry, but we need to move on. I think we've got your question. Can we please move on? We need to take questions in the room as well.
I had indicated, and I waited very patiently when I said I've got a couple of questions.
Ross, can we please mute the audio? Questions in the room? I've got a hand up here.
Thank you. My question is directed to Simba. Simba, in your slides, like I saw you had those mines A until E or something like that. And you had their life of mine. And I think the life of mine, the future one is like 2030, something like that, which is quite near when you're looking at the mining perspective. So my question to you is, do you know if those companies, the mining companies, if they have or are working on strategies for staying in business, or are they completely like closing off? And then the second one is about the alternative work that you spoke about. So I just want to know from your perspective, because I know that you were talking about, you touched a bit on the renewable strategies. So I just want to find out, like, in terms of like the alternative work, what does that look like? Yeah. Question.
Right. Okay, so we'll take that as the last one and then get answers. Up here.
Hi, my question is also for Simba. You mentioned impact and needs on coal mine workers in the transition, and I think you only looked at semi-skilled workers as well as the above 35 people. Have you done research perhaps on the people who are injured on duties in these mines and people living in disabilities in communities and how they are impacted by this transition? Thank you.
Ian, Can we have that mic, please? Please give it to Simba? So Simba, you can start with the questions, with answers, and then Muhammed, you can. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe just to start with from the first question, I think it was not directed to me, but just to respond, my 5 cents is on it, we are facing a double transition. I think somebody spoke about, we are facing a natural endogenous transition as well as an exogenous transition brought in by the energy transition and all that. But either way, our mines operate on a defined lifespan. The coal plants operate on a defined lifespan. We've got majority of coal plants that are aimed to close down by 2045. So the question is, what will happen to the workers that are working in those industries and any other workers that depends on those activities? So whether there is global push to transition as a result of climate change, but already South Africa has a problem where plants are already being decommissioned. So the just aspect here is what will happen to the workers, what will happen to the communities. So closure will happen. So the debate here is, do we want a just closure or we don't want a just closure? Now to come back to your question on the mining companies that are closing. Again, I think our mining companies operate on a defined lifespan. I think the last that is closing from the SOPs that we assessed is 2050. After 2050, but the closest one is 2030, near 2030. So basically what I liked in the SOPs is that mining companies, they do, because they're required by legislation to put closure plans. So in the event that closure is unavoidable, they are required to mention strategies that they will use to support the workers after closure. So they have in their SOPs different closures that I've outlined, but that's what I've said, that some of their strategies are already unrealistic and they are not considering the current energy transition and the just transition lens. So that is where government needs to intervene and check what are the industries offering to provide from their SOPs upon closure, and where can government chip in and support or complement the existing support. From that SOPs, I realized that most of SOP commitments are active labor market strategies, but what remains lacking is passive labor protection, passive labor strategies, as well as social protection, which are also suggested in the recommendation that the government needs to intervene and provide social protection and passive labor market strategies. When it comes to impact, that was a summary of what we have done, but we grouped workers based on 5 groups using age and skills levels. So we had those that near retirement, we have the middle-aged, we had the young, then we had the low qualified and the high qualified. But we didn't consider those that have been injured. But I think if you go through the report further down speaks about those that have been injured already, or those that have got diseases, but they have not yet been identified, or they've not yet been verified that they've diseases that they came out with from the mine closure. South Africa has an act that protects those that have been injured at work, such as the Occupational and Injury Act. But we also have limitations that we identified in the report, that one only caters for the workers that have been injured during the life of a mine. But what about those that will go home, but they've got some diseases that have not yet been identified? Or what about everyone else that have not yet been, that are not benefiting from that Occupational and Injury Act? I think it's COIDA Act, something like that. I hope I answered you well. Thank you.
Thanks, Simba. Mohammed?
Mr. Hamida's question.
Yes.
Okay, just to avoid any confusion about what it is I am saying. So the point I was making was that, so as has been acknowledged to the various presentations and discussions, this is a long-term process of planning, right? It's not, we're not planning for 2 years or 5 years. You get volatility in energy markets in short term, right? 2 years, 5 years, but we're talking about a long-term process. Okay, the second point is that we can only say, the further you go into the future, the harder it becomes to make statements with precision or accuracy. We can only say, given the state of the world now, and based on what we know of people's plans now, and if they abide by those plans, how the world might look like, right? And we make other assumptions, etc. So the point I was making was that in all likelihood, we may see a shift in coal demand from the west to the east. We currently know that in Eastern countries like China and India, they do self-fund coal. However, we also know that they're quite ambitious on green tech and producing green tech and decarbonizing within their economies as well as exporting some of this technology. So if we were to pursue a direction, assuming that those export markets remain, right, that's risky for us in the long term, because should they follow through with their decarbonization plans, we will get hit with reduced coal demand in a way that we've not prepared for. So the core idea is that there's uncertainty about the future. We have trade partners that still consume coal. It's not clear how long they're going to consume those coal for. And the way we can assess that is by looking at their decarbonization plans. And obviously, this will have to be monitored on a year-by-year basis. It's not static. It'll have to be looked at on a year-by-year basis, and then we'll have to adjust based on that. There is still inherent risk given that they plan to decarbonize. So that's my point. I hope it's clear.
All right. Thanks, Muhammad. Any other questions in the room? We have 2 online, but I'd like to start in the room again. All right. So let me rather do this. Gaylo, maybe we can have your thoughts, and then if we can find Woody's question, if we still have time, I'll try to ask it, but can we have your last thoughts? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, just I think briefly, it's been really rich, and I think what this discussion prompts us to do is maybe avoid kind of binary thinking as much as possible. I think we tend to see it very much as either or, whereas frankly, in the short term and probably even in the medium term, it's very much additionality, you know, about trying to build a new economy on top of the one that we currently have. I think no one anywhere in the world is asking for anyone to close the entire coal economy in the next few years. You know, no one's doing that. You know, it's a long-term process. But one should use this time to build that new economy of tomorrow. I think that's the best risk mitigation strategy that we can have effectively, is to say, look, inaction is clearly not in our favor. You know, we could bury our head in the sand and say, let's keep on business as usual, on the assumption that we're actually happy with business as usual. I don't think anyone is happy with the current situation in any shape or form. You know, so we have a little bit of leeway, a little bit of lead time to actually organize our competitiveness going forward, to build an economy that's potentially different, a lot more inclusive. I think that's where green technologies and the transition are a force of disruption, and that's an opportunity. In parallel, of course, let's try and improve the old economy on the backbone of, you know, the initiatives that are happening in mining and other industries. But let's not be so, I think, so binary. And then finally, I think let's look at what's in our own interest, you know, from a South African perspective. And by the way, that's not disconnected from global interest. I think that's what's important. Rather than asking, is there an agenda, someone forcing on us, let's look at what do we want to do and let's do it. And let's be clear about that strategy. And I think at the moment, you know, we must not be forced to choose or be put in a box and say, look, this is our strategy. We know how it's going to unfold. We are using the time that we have over, you know, the next 10, 20 years to restructure our economy and build new activities, new sectors, new opportunities. And I think that is the approach that we should take. And that's certainly what's coming out of, I think, the discussion today, that, you know, is a multifaceted solutions. And we're not really trying to say, look, we are choosing one over the other. We are trying to transform our existing sectors and build new one going forward. Goes on that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Galo. Any 2 seconds each? Any closing words before we close the session?
So as for me and my colleague with our research findings, I think there is we did reflect that there is a potential for industry provisions to stimulate a just transition, but unless if we manage to mitigate the challenges. So I think policymakers have to really look at some of the challenges for delivering industry provisions and making an impact and mitigate those challenges, as well as we shouldn't expect the companies to achieve the just transition on their own, as well as the government can't do it on its own. So there is need for close collaboration between the government and the industry for a just transition. Thank you.
Yeah, from my side, I just want to say, you know, we, as a country, we're not alone in this process. There's other countries going through this process as well, although we do have quite unique socioeconomic context that needs to be borne into account. And I think the main thing is that this gets the policy importance that it needs and the attention that it needs. And we pursue you know, mitigation measures in reasonable time before the impacts start to hit us severely.
On the part of labor, I think there's a realization of the urgency to participate more actively in the planning, because there are some things that are going to start impacting workers directly, whether it's in the next couple of years. Even outside of government policy, some companies are already making their own shift and diversification to be able to participate in the green economy. What is happening now on the part of labor is now fighting for the just part of the just transition and making sure that it's not just about those immediate workers. On the part of labor themselves, they have to move away from, or on top of the participation in platforms like Netlac and PCC and workplace immediate mine companies, they have to also now start reconnecting with communities so that they can build a stronger movement for just transition, because it is affecting people outside of the workplaces. Thank you.
Thanks, Chere. So we got Woody's question. We'll email it to you in case you will want to respond. Thank you, everyone, for attending this learning event. Thank you to our speakers, to our discussant. We hope to see you during the next one. Have a good afternoon. There's food at the back.